I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. Not gradually, as most betrayals unfold, but with the sharp precision of a blade finding its mark. It was at my grandson's christening in St. Margaret's Church overlooking Lake Windermere, when my daughter-in-law Rebecca leaned over the ancient stone baptismal font and whispered two words that would haunt me for months. Just us. What I thought was a tender moment between grandmother and grandchild became the opening move in the most calculated game I'd ever witnessed. And I was the target. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 78, I thought I'd seen every shade of human nature. I'd survived my husband's death, raised my son James through his rebellious years, and carefully stewarded the lakefront estate that had belonged to our family since 1820. Whitmore House wasn't just property, it was legacy, history, the embodiment of 8 generations who'd walked these halls, tended these gardens, and gazed out at the same pristine waters that had inspired Wordsworth himself. The christening had been everything I dreamed of. Little Thomas, barely 3 months old, had slept peacefully through the service while sunlight streamed through the medieval stained glass, casting jeweled patterns across the congregation. James stood proud beside Rebecca, his arm around her waist, and for a moment, I felt the deep satisfaction of continuity, my bloodline continuing, my legacy secure. But then came that whisper. Rebecca had asked to hold Thomas during the blessing, and as Reverend Morrison began the ancient words, she leaned close to the baby's ear. From where I sat in the front pew, I could barely make out her lips moving, but the words reached me clearly. Just us, darling. Just us. The way she said it, with such deliberate emphasis, made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. What happened next would have seemed innocent to anyone else. Rebecca's handbag had fallen open beside the font, spilling its contents across the worn stone floor. As I bent to help gather her belongings, my fingers closed around a thick manila envelope. For just a moment, before she snatched it away, I glimpsed the letterhead, Pemberton Associates Probate Lawyers. Below it, in bold lettering, Last Will and Testament, Eleanor Whitmore estate transfer documentation. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The christening celebration that followed passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. I watched Rebecca move through our guests with practiced charm, accepting congratulations, discussing the baby's future, all while that envelope burned in my memory like a brand. She caught my eye once across the crowded drawing room of Whitmore House, and for just an instant, her mask slipped. The smile remained, but her eyes held something cold and calculating, the look of someone who'd already won a game I didn't even know I was playing. That night, after the last guest had departed and James had driven Rebecca and the baby back to their flat in Kendall, I sat in my late husband's study, surrounded by decades of family documents. The house felt different somehow, less secure, as if its very foundations had been shaken by that whispered promise and those legal papers. I poured myself a generous measure of Henry's aged whiskey and tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. What was Rebecca planning? And why did I feel like I was already 10 steps behind in whatever game she'd initiated? If you're finding this story as unsettling as I did that night, please leave a comment below and subscribe to hear how this family nightmare unfolded. You might recognize the warning signs I missed, or perhaps you've lived through something similar yourself. The days following the christening brought subtle but disturbing changes. Rebecca, who had previously visited Whitmore House only for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, suddenly became a frequent presence. She would arrive unannounced with Thomas, claiming she wanted him to bond with his inheritance, or that she needed a quiet place for him to nap away from the noise of town. Each visit followed the same pattern. She would settle into Henry's old chair, cradle Thomas, and make casual observations about the house's maintenance, its valuable antiques, or the burden of managing such a large property alone. "Eleanor, darling," she said one Tuesday afternoon, her voice dripping with false concern, "you really shouldn't be climbing those stairs to the 3rd floor anymore. What if you fell? What would happen to little Thomas's future then?" She bounced the baby on her knee, using his innocent presence as emotional ammunition. James worries constantly about you rattling around in this big house by yourself. I began to notice Rebecca photographing rooms, supposedly for a family album, but always focusing on the most valuable pieces: the Chippendale furniture, the original watercolors, the collection of first edition books. She asked probing questions about the estate's finances, disguised as helpful concerns about tax implications and maintenance costs. When I mentioned speaking with my solicitor about updating my will to include provisions for Thomas, her interest sharpened visibly. "Oh, you mustn't trouble yourself with such complicated matters," she cooed, adjusting Thomas's blanket with theatrical tenderness. "James and I have been researching inheritance law, actually. Did you know there are much simpler ways to ensure family property stays protected? Direct transfers, trusts established for grandchildren. So much more efficient than traditional wills that can be contested or delayed in probate." The way she said contested made my skin crawl. It was the same tone one might use when discussing the weather, but I caught the underlying threat. Someone was already thinking about challenging my will, and I had a sinking suspicion who that someone might be. My unease deepened when I discovered Rebecca had been asking pointed questions about my daily routines. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been cleaning Whitmore House for 20 years, mentioned that Rebecca had inquired about my medication schedule, my driving habits, and whether I'd been forgetful lately. She'd even suggested that Mrs. Henderson should keep an eye on Eleanor's mental state and report any concerning behaviors. "She seemed ever so worried about you, Mrs. Whitmore," Mrs. Henderson said, her weathered face creased with confusion. "Kept asking if you'd been repeating yourself or forgetting conversations. Said she was concerned you might be developing, well, problems with your mind." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Rebecca wasn't just after my estate. She was systematically building a case for my mental incompetence. Every innocent conversation, every moment of normal elderly forgetfulness, every time I had to ask someone to repeat something in a crowded room, it was all being cataloged as evidence of cognitive decline. But the most chilling discovery came when I found James's laptop open in the kitchen during one of their visits. Rebecca had stepped outside to take a phone call, and James was upstairs changing Thomas's nappy. The screen displayed a Google search history that made my heart race. Elderly dementia legal guardian, inheritance when parent mentally unfit, how to prove grandparent dangerous around children, and most damning of all, fastest way to transfer property from elderly owner. I quickly photographed the screen with my mobile phone, my hands trembling as I heard Rebecca's footsteps on the gravel path outside. When she returned, all smiles and maternal warmth, I forced myself to act normally, but inside I was reeling. This wasn't opportunistic greed. This was a methodical, calculated assault on my autonomy, my property, and my relationship with my family. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after discovering the search history, Rebecca arrived alone, claiming James was working late and she needed somewhere quiet for Thomas to sleep. But Thomas wasn't with her. Instead, she carried a leather briefcase and wore the expression of someone about to deliver an ultimatum. She settled into Henry's chair with disturbing familiarity and opened the briefcase with deliberate ceremony. Inside were legal documents, property assessments, and what appeared to be medical evaluations. My medical evaluations, though I'd never authorized them. "Eleanor, we need to discuss your future," Rebecca began, her voice stripped of its usual false warmth. "James and I have been consulting with specialists about age-related cognitive decline, and we're deeply concerned about your ability to safely maintain this property and make sound financial decisions." She spread the documents across Henry's desk like a dealer laying out cards. "These assessments, based on observations from family and household staff, suggest you may be experiencing early-stage dementia. For Thomas's safety, and your own, we think it's time to consider alternative living arrangements." The audacity took my breath away. She was sitting in my husband's chair, in my family home, telling me I was mentally incompetent based on fabricated evidence. But what struck me most was her reference to Thomas's safety. She was using my own grandson as a weapon against me. Of course, we want to keep this within the family, she continued, her tone becoming almost conspiratorial. No need for court proceedings or public guardianship hearings that might reflect poorly on the Whitmore name. If you're willing to transfer the estate to James now, with full rights of residence for you, naturally, we can handle everything privately, with dignity. I stared at her, finally seeing clearly the predator that had been circling my family for months. This wasn't about Thomas's future or my well-being. This was about a calculated plan to separate an elderly woman from her property using emotional manipulation and fabricated medical concerns. I need time to consider this, I managed to say, fighting to keep my voice steady. Rebecca's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. Of course, darling, but don't take too long. These situations have a way of becoming complicated if they're not handled promptly. And we do want what's best for everyone, don't we? Especially little Thomas. The threat was crystal clear. Comply, or face a very public battle for my competency with my own grandson held as collateral. That evening, alone in Whitmore House, I realized I was fighting for more than property. I was fighting for my dignity, my relationship with James, and my right to remain in control of my own life. Rebecca had underestimated one crucial factor. I might be 78, but I hadn't survived nearly 8 decades by being anyone's fool. It was time to discover exactly who Rebecca really was, and what other elderly victims might have fallen prey to her particular brand of familial predation. The investigation that consumed the following weeks revealed a pattern so disturbing that even I, in my darkest suspicions, hadn't imagined its scope. What I discovered about Rebecca's past would not only save my estate, but expose a calculated campaign of elder abuse that had been years in the making. My first call was to Margaret Thornberry, my oldest friend and former colleague from the Windermere Historical Society. Margaret had always possessed an uncanny ability to uncover information, a skill honed during her decades as a research librarian at the University of Cambridge. If anyone could help me dig into Rebecca's background, it would be her. Eleanor, dear, Margaret said when I explained my suspicions. You know, I've always thought there was something rather calculated about that girl. The way she appeared in James's life so suddenly, already pregnant, with such a convenient story about her tragic past. Give me a few days. While Margaret worked her research magic, I began documenting every interaction with Rebecca, every subtle threat, every manipulation tactic. I installed a small recording device in Henry's study, perfectly legal in my own home, and began preparing for what I sensed would be an inevitable confrontation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, while dusting the guest bedroom Rebecca had been using during her extended visits, discovered a mobile phone hidden beneath the mattress. When it rang during cleaning, Mrs. Henderson answered, thinking it might be Rebecca calling from downstairs. Mrs. Patterson? The voice on the other end sounded elderly and confused. Rebecca, dear, is that you? I've been trying to reach you for weeks. The solicitor says the house sale has fallen through and I don't understand. You promised you'd handle everything after poor George passed. Where is my money, dear? I can't stay in this care home much longer without payment. Mrs. Henderson, bless her practical Yorkshire soul, had the presence of mind to take detailed notes. The caller was Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, age 83, from Harrogate. Her late husband George had owned a substantial Victorian property, and Rebecca, who had apparently been George's home care assistant, had convinced the grieving widow to sell the house and move into residential care, promising to manage all the financial arrangements. That evening, I drove to Harrogate. Dorothy Patterson was indeed in a care home, confused and frightened. Believing she had no money left despite having owned a property worth over $400,000, the facility's administrator confirmed they hadn't received payment for her care in 2 months. Such a sweet girl, that Rebecca, Dorothy said, clutching my hand with desperate strength. George was so fond of her. She said she'd take care of everything after he passed. But I don't understand what's happened to my house money. She keeps saying there were complications with the sale, but the solicitor told me a different story entirely. The solicitor's records told a chilling tale. Rebecca had indeed arranged the property sale, but the proceeds had been transferred to an account she controlled, supposedly, in trust for Dorothy's care. The money had then been moved through several accounts before disappearing entirely. Dorothy had been systematically defrauded by someone she trusted completely. But Dorothy wasn't Rebecca's only victim. Margaret's research had uncovered a pattern spanning nearly a decade. Rebecca's real name was Rebecca Thornfield, and she had a history of targeting elderly widowers through home care agencies, befriending their families, and positioning herself to inherit or gain control of their assets. In each case, she disappeared once the money was secured, leaving behind confused elderly victims and no forwarding address. James had been her most ambitious target yet. By getting pregnant and marrying into the Whitmore family, she hadn't just gained access to one estate, she had positioned herself to claim a multi-generational legacy worth over £2 million. The most damning evidence came from a former colleague at one of the care agencies. Rebecca had been dismissed for inappropriate relationships with clients' families and suspected financial irregularities. She had a particular pattern: target elderly men with significant property, gain their trust through attentive care, then cultivate relationships with their adult children or grandchildren. She was brilliant at it, the former colleague admitted during our recorded phone conversation. She could spot vulnerability from a mile away. Widowed men who were lonely, adult children who felt guilty about putting their parents in care, families dealing with inheritance tensions. She knew exactly how to present herself as the solution to their problems. Armed with this evidence, I faced a terrible choice. I could expose Rebecca immediately, but that would likely destroy James emotionally and potentially give her time to flee with Thomas. Or I could set a trap, allowing her to reveal her true intentions while ensuring I had legal recourse to protect both my estate and my grandson. The decision was made for me when James appeared at my door the following Sunday, looking haggard and confused. Rebecca hadn't come with him, and Thomas was notably absent. "Mum," he said, sinking into a chair in my kitchen, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you having problems with your memory? Rebecca says you've been acting strangely, forgetting conversations, repeating yourself. She's worried you might be developing dementia." The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. My son was sitting in my kitchen, questioning my mental competency based on lies told by a woman who'd been systematically defrauding elderly victims for nearly a decade. But I also saw something in his eyes: doubt, confusion, perhaps even a flicker of suspicion about his wife's motives. "James," I said carefully, "before I answer that question, I need to show you something. But I want you to promise me you'll look at all the evidence before making any decisions about my mental state." I spread out the documentation Margaret and I had compiled: the records of Rebecca's previous victims, the care home testimonies, the proof of financial fraud, and the recordings of her threats about Thomas's safety and my supposed incompetency. As James read through the evidence, his face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, a kind of sick understanding. When he reached Dorothy Patterson's testimony, his hands began to shake. "This can't be right," he whispered. "Rebecca was caring for an elderly man before we met, but she said he died peacefully and left her a small inheritance. That's how she could afford to stop working when Thomas was born." "The inheritance was real," I said gently, "but it wasn't left to her willingly, and it wasn't small. James, Rebecca has been planning this from the moment she targeted your family. Her pregnancy, your marriage, her sudden interest in my estate, none of it was coincidental." The final piece of evidence was the most heartbreaking: a recorded conversation where Rebecca discussed her long-term investment in the Whitmore family with someone she believed to be a fellow scammer. Margaret had arranged for a private investigator to make contact with Rebecca through a mutual acquaintance, posing as someone looking for advice on managing elderly family members. In that recording, Rebecca described her strategy with chilling clinical detail. "The old woman trusts me because of the baby. She thinks I'm protecting her bloodline, but I'm actually positioning myself to inherit everything. The son is completely under my control, guilty about his mother living alone, desperate to prove he's a good father. I give it 6 months before she's declared incompetent, and I have full control of the estate." James listened to his wife's voice describing him as a manipulated fool, and me as an obstacle to be removed, and something fundamental broke inside him. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for several long minutes, staring at the evidence of his wife's betrayal. "Where is Thomas now?" I asked gently. "With Rebecca's sister in Manchester," he said hollowly. "Rebecca said she needed to get him away from here because you'd been acting erratically around him. She said you'd grabbed him roughly and he'd cried for hours afterward." Another lie. I'd barely had the chance to hold Thomas since the christening, and when I did, it was always under Rebecca's watchful supervision. "James, we need to act quickly," I said. "Rebecca is already positioning herself to claim I'm an unfit grandmother and potentially an unfit property owner. If we don't stop this now, she'll disappear with Thomas and my estate, leaving both of us with nothing but legal bills and broken hearts." The confrontation we orchestrated took place the following evening. James had called Rebecca, claiming he was ready to discuss practical arrangements for my care and the estate transfer. She arrived at Whitmore House with her leather briefcase, but this time she wasn't alone. She brought a man she introduced as Dr. Morrison, no relation to our vicar, supposedly a specialist in geriatric mental health who could provide an independent assessment of my competency. What Rebecca didn't know was that Margaret, Mrs. Henderson, and a legitimate solicitor were positioned in the adjoining rooms, recording everything through equipment the private investigator had installed. James had also arranged for the local police to be on standby, should we need to prevent Rebecca from leaving with any documents or making threats about Thomas. The meeting began with Rebecca's usual theatrical concern for my well-being, but her mask slipped quickly when I began asking specific questions about her background. When I mentioned Dorothy Patterson's name, her face went completely white. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Then perhaps you can explain these," James said, placing the evidence file on the table. "Banking records, testimonies from your previous victims, recordings of your conversations about defrauding my family." For a moment, Rebecca sat in stunned silence. Then her expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, pure, undisguised rage. The caring daughter-in-law, the concerned mother, the helpful family member, all of it vanished, leaving behind someone I barely recognized. "You stupid old woman," she snarled at me. "Do you think anyone will believe your paranoid fantasies? I have medical documentation proving you're mentally incompetent. I have witnesses who'll testify to your erratic behavior. And I have your grandson, who you'll never see again if you try to cause problems for me." "Actually," said a voice from the doorway, "you don't have any of those things." Detective Inspector Sarah Collins stepped into the room, followed by 2 constables. The private investigator had worked with local police to coordinate Rebecca's arrest the moment she made direct threats about Thomas. Rebecca Thornfield, also known as Rebecca Patterson, also known as Rebecca Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, extortion, and child endangerment. As the police led Rebecca away, she turned back with one final threat. "You'll never prove anything, and you'll never see that baby again." But she was wrong on both counts. The evidence Margaret and I had compiled was more than sufficient for prosecution, and James's immediate legal action secured emergency custody of Thomas within hours. Rebecca's sister in Manchester turned out to be another accomplice, and Thomas was safely returned to his father that same evening. The weeks that followed brought a mixture of relief and rebuilding. James moved temporarily into Whitmore House with Thomas, needing time to process the betrayal and plan their future. The investigation into Rebecca's crimes revealed at least 6 other elderly victims across northern England, with financial losses totaling over $1.2 million. Dorothy Patterson was reunited with most of her stolen money and moved to a proper care facility. The other victims, or their families, began the process of recovering what they could from Rebecca's hidden assets. Most importantly, James and I began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship, damaged by months of Rebecca's manipulation. The baby she'd used as a weapon became, instead, the bridge that brought our family back together. Little Thomas spent his days crawling through the halls of Whitmore House, unconscious of the drama that had swirled around his first months of life. Watching James rediscover his love for the family estate while caring for his son gave me hope that our legacy would indeed continue, but now with wisdom earned through nearly losing everything. 6 months later, Rebecca was sentenced to 8 years in prison for multiple counts of fraud and elder abuse. The judge noted the particular cruelty of using family relationships and children as tools for financial exploitation. In her victim impact statement, Dorothy Patterson described the devastating psychological effects of being betrayed by someone she'd trusted with her late husband's memory and her own welfare. But for me, the real victory wasn't Rebecca's imprisonment. It was the evening James found me in Henry's study, updating my will to include proper provisions for Thomas's education and future. "Mom," he said, settling into the chair opposite me, "I owe you an apology. I should have listened to my instincts about Rebecca. I should have trusted your judgment instead of questioning your mental state based on her lies." "You were protecting your family," I replied. "That's what good men do. You just learned, as I did, that sometimes the threat comes from inside the family rather than outside it." James picked up the family photograph from Henry's desk. 3 generations of Whitmores standing beside Lake Windermere. "How did you know?" he asked. "What made you suspicious when everyone else accepted her so completely?" I thought about that whispered promise at the christening, the legal documents, the calculating look in Rebecca's eyes when she thought no one was watching. "Experience," I said finally. 78 years of watching people, learning to recognize the difference between genuine love and skilled performance. Rebecca was very good at her act, but she made one crucial mistake, which was, she underestimated the power of a grandmother's instinct. When someone threatens your grandchild, truly threatens them by using them as a weapon, there's nothing you won't do to protect them. Rebecca thought Thomas was her ace in the hole, but he was actually her downfall. The moment I realized she was using him to manipulate our family, her game was over. As I write this, Thomas is now walking, exploring every corner of Whitmore House with the fearless curiosity of a child who knows he's loved and safe. James has begun taking over more of the estate management, learning about the property and investments that will someday be his responsibility. We've established legal protections to prevent future exploitation, but more importantly, we've learned to trust our instincts about the people we allow into our family circle. The lakefront estate that Rebecca tried so desperately to steal remains in Whitmore hands, but it's changed by our experience. It's no longer just a symbol of family continuity. It's a reminder that true legacy isn't about property or money. It's about the wisdom to protect what matters most and the courage to fight for it when necessary. Sometimes visitors ask about the family drama that made local headlines. I tell them that every old house has its stories, and not all of them have happy endings. But this one did, because we learned the difference between family by blood and family by choice, between manipulation and genuine care, between what we inherit and what we earn. Rebecca's whispered promise at the christening, "just us," was meant to be the beginning of my family's end. Instead, it became the catalyst for something stronger, a family that truly knows and protects each other, tested by fire, and emerged more resilient. That's a legacy worth passing on. What did you think of this family's ordeal? Have you ever encountered someone who seemed too good to be true? Or noticed warning signs that others dismissed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories about the complex dynamics that shape our families. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the darkest chapters of our lives.